The Stoic silence. Why the strongest people never chase, beg, or explain themselves in. Before we begin, if this kind of content speaks to your soul, if you're someone who's tired of feeling drained chasing people who don't chase back, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is built for people who are ready to grow, ready to reclaim their power, and ready to carry themselves differently. Subscribe, hit the bell, and let's get into something that might just change the way you move through this world forever. Now let me ask you something. When was the last time you stayed silent when everything inside you was screaming to speak? When was the last time you walked away without sending that final message, without making that one last call, without writing out that paragraph explaining yourself to someone who already decided they didn't care? Most people never make it to that moment, because we live in a world that is obsessed with being heard, a world that confuses noise with power, a world where people are constantly trying to prove something, prove they're right, prove they're worthy, prove they're not what someone else said they were. People explain, they over-explain, they argue, they justify, and sometimes when they're truly desperate, they beg. They beg just to be seen, just to be acknowledged, just to get a fraction of the understanding they deserve. But the Stoic doesn't do that. The Stoic doesn't beg for attention. The Stoic doesn't chase validation. The Stoic doesn't explain himself to a world that hasn't earned the right to that explanation. Because the Stoic knows something that most people spend their entire lives trying to learn. Silence is strength. And I mean a very specific kind of silence. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, not the silence of someone who's too afraid to speak, but the silence of someone who has mastered themselves so completely that they no longer need the world's approval to feel whole. The silence of someone who understands that reaction is a gift, and not everyone deserves that gift. Now think about what most people do when they're hurt, when they're rejected, when they're misunderstood. They rush, they chase, they try to fix what's broken by explaining themselves to people who already decided not to understand. They convince themselves that if they could just find the right words, if they could just say it perfectly, everything would fall back into place. That's weakness pretending to be courage. You call someone and they don't pick up. You text again, you message again. You pour your heart out in a long paragraph, hoping they'll finally see your worth. Maybe you stay up at night replaying conversations, editing the script in your head, preparing for the moment they'll finally listen. And when they don't, you spiral. You try harder. You give more. You lower yourself just a little bit more, thinking that if you just sacrifice enough, they'll come around. But here's the truth that most people are too afraid to confront. The more you explain, the more you beg, the more you chase, the more power you surrender. You're not fighting for respect. You're auctioning off your self-worth, piece by piece, to someone who doesn't even want to buy it. And that is not Stoic. That is not strength. That is the slow, invisible erosion of everything that makes you powerful. The Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, these men understood the power of silence on a level that most modern thinkers haven't come close to grasping, not because they didn't feel pain, not because they were emotionally disconnected, but because they understood something fundamental about control. As Epictetus once said, the more we value things outside our control, the less control we have. Let that land for a moment. When you chase someone's attention, when you beg for someone's understanding, when you measure your peace by how someone else responds to you, you are handing over your control. You're saying out loud with every action, my happiness depends on what you do next, and that is not peace, that is not freedom. That is a prison with invisible bars, and the other person holds the key. Real strength, true Stoic strength, looks like this. Someone disrespects you, and you walk away without a word, not out of pride, not out of coldness, not out of ego, but because your dignity doesn't need to scream, your dignity doesn't chase. Your dignity doesn't explain itself to someone who's already demonstrated they don't deserve the explanation. It silently detaches, and in that detachment it becomes immovable. This silence is not emptiness. This silence is not passivity. It is the fullest expression of self-discipline that a human being can demonstrate. It is self-respect made visible through what you choose not to do. It is inner strength that says loudly, in the quietest possible way, I don't need to be heard by you to hear myself. And this kind of silence terrifies people. Because when you don't react, when you don't chase, when you don't explain, they lose the control they thought they had over you. And that confusion, that sudden awareness of your absence, speaks volumes that no message ever could. Today we are going to go deep into 6 truths. 6 reasons why silence is the most underestimated superpower in the human experience. 6 reasons why those who practice it never chase, never beg, and never feel the need to explain themselves. We're going to look at these through the lens of Stoicism, through the words of the great thinkers who walked this path before us, and through the very real, very human experiences that make these lessons necessary. If you've ever overgiven to someone who took you for granted, if you've been misunderstood and responded by over-explaining, if you've ever chased someone who walked away and felt your dignity crumble in the process, this is your moment. This is your turning point. Let these words be the mirror you didn't know you needed. And I want to say this before we get into it. Don't skip any part of what follows, because one truth, just one, might shift something in you that's been waiting to shift for a very long time. Drop this in the comments right now as we begin. My silence is my power. Let's go. Point 1. Silence makes them feel your absence, not just hear your words. Have you ever noticed something strange about the way human psychology works? Something almost paradoxical. When you stop chasing, people start thinking about you more. When you stop explaining, people start wondering about your reasons. When you go quiet, the noise of your absence becomes louder than anything you could have said. That is the paradox of silence. It doesn't push people away. Done right, it pulls them in. It creates a gravity that words never could. Now, think about the last time you were genuinely hurt by someone. Maybe someone went cold on you out of nowhere. Maybe someone disrespected you and acted like it was nothing. Maybe you were ghosted after you invested emotionally, and you felt that familiar cocktail of confusion, pain, and desperation rising inside you. Your instinct probably screamed at you. Say something, fight back, defend your worth, make them understand what they did. And that instinct, as human and understandable as it is exactly what keeps people trapped. Because here's what most people don't fully understand. The moment you react, the moment you chase, the moment you flood someone's inbox with emotional paragraphs, you shift the dynamic entirely. You stop being someone they think about and start being someone they manage. You stop being a presence they miss and start being a pressure they avoid. You take all the power that your silence could have held and scatter it across a series of messages that they will probably read, dismiss, and use to feel better about their own choices. The more you talk, the less they listen. The more you chase, the more justified their distance feels to them. The more you explain, the less valuable your words become. But silence. Silence is different. Silence is disruptive in the deepest possible way, because the human mind cannot sit comfortably in uncertainty. When you go quiet, when you stop being predictable, when you withdraw the emotional reaction they expected, their mind fills in the blank spaces with questions. Why isn't she responding? What changed? Did he stop caring? Did I go too far? Do they not need me anymore? That's the moment the power shifts. As Elbert Hubbard said, "He who does not understand your silence will probably not understand your words." And he was absolutely right. Because the people who truly need to hear what your silence is saying, they hear it, they understand it, they feel it in their gut. And the people who don't understand it, no amount of words will reach them anyway. So you might as well save the words and let the silence do what it does best. There's something else happening here that goes beyond strategy. Something deeper and more important than whether or not someone notices your absence. When you go silent, you are also doing something profound for yourself. You're stopping the bleeding. Every message you send, every explanation you offer, every call you make to someone who doesn't pick up, it costs you something. It costs you energy. It costs you self-respect. It costs you the belief that you are someone worth pursuing. And over time, those costs add up into a debt that you pay with your own peace. Your silence is not just a message to them. It's a message to yourself. It says, I value myself enough to stop giving to someone who has shown they won't receive it properly. See, silence holds up a mirror, not to them initially, but to you. It shows you who actually reaches out when you go quiet. It shows you who disappears when you stop doing the emotional heavy lifting. It shows you with painful clarity who was there because of what you gave them and who was there because of who you are. And that clarity, as uncomfortable as it is freedom. You stop wasting energy trying to be understood by people who don't even understand themselves. You stop trying to heal wounds through conversation with the very person who caused them. You give yourself the gift of space, and in that space, something extraordinary happens. You remember that you are whole, that your worth doesn't live in their response, that your dignity doesn't require their acknowledgement to be real. So the next time everything inside you screams to speak, to chase, to explain, pause, take a breath, and choose silence. Not because you're cold, not because you don't care, but because you care enough about yourself to protect what's yours. Your silence is the loudest thing they'll ever hear from you. Point 2. When you stay silent, you hear the truth louder. The world is extraordinarily loud, and most people have forgotten what it feels like to sit in genuine silence. Not just the absence of sound, but the deep internal quietness that allows you to actually hear yourself think. We are surrounded at every moment by noise, notifications, opinions, other people's emergencies, social media feeds designed to keep your attention fractured and your emotions reactive. And into all of this noise we pour our pain, we call friends, we seek advice, we scroll endlessly looking for something that resonates. We confront the people who hurt us, hoping that a conversation will somehow undo the damage. But what the Stoics understood, and what most modern people are slowly rediscovering through therapy and mindfulness and hard life experience, is this. Real answers do not come from noise. They never did. They come from reflection. They come from silence. They come from the moments when you stop running from your own thoughts long enough to actually hear them. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journals, the ones he never intended anyone to read, words that feel startlingly relevant thousands of years later. He wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment." Think about the weight of that. The pain you feel isn't just about what happened. It's about the meaning you've assigned to what happened. And the only place where you can actually examine and revise that meaning is in the silence of your own mind. When you go quiet, truly quiet, something shifts in the nervous system. The cortisol levels drop. The emotional flooding starts to recede. The part of your brain that was in pure reactive mode, the part that was drafting angry messages and rehearsing perfect comebacks, begins to quiet down. And in that quieting, the truth begins to rise. Not the emotional version of the truth, not the version that your wounded pride tells you, but the actual, clear, sometimes uncomfortable truth. You start to hear things like, "This isn't the first time they made me feel this way. I just kept giving them the benefit of the doubt." Or, "I was so afraid of losing them that I accepted things I never should have accepted." Or even, "The anger I feel isn't really about them leaving. It's about me staying long after I should have walked away." These are not revelations that come from a conversation with someone else. They come from a conversation with yourself. And that conversation can only happen in silence. There's a crucial difference that the Stoics understood and that modern culture almost completely ignores. The difference between reacting and responding. When you react, you act from emotion. You act immediately. You act from the wounded, frightened, ego-driven part of yourself that just wants the pain to stop. When you respond, you act from clarity. You act after reflection. You act from the grounded, values-driven part of yourself that knows what actually matters. Reaction lives in noise. Response lives in silence. Stoics embraced what might be called a sacred pause, a deliberate space between stimulus and response. And in that space, they made decisions that aligned with their deepest values rather than their most immediate emotions. That's not suppression. That's wisdom. It's the difference between someone who controls themselves and someone who is controlled by their circumstances. Here's something else that silence gives you that noise never can. When you go quiet, people around you reveal themselves. Without the constant noise of your words, your reactions, your emotional availability filling every space, people show you who they are. The ones who genuinely care will check in. They'll wonder why you're quiet. They'll reach out with concern, not because you trained them to, but because they actually value your presence. The ones who were taking you for granted, they'll go quiet too, because they were only showing up for the version of you that was constantly available, constantly explaining, constantly giving. Silence is a filter, and it filters ruthlessly. The more silent you become, the more you start trusting patterns over words. You stop being manipulated by beautiful explanations for ugly behavior. You start seeing people not as they present themselves, but as they consistently act when they think you're not watching closely. You start relying on something far more reliable than conversation, which is reality, which is what actually happens, which is the evidence of who someone is when they don't have to perform for you. So when you're overwhelmed, when the emotions are pulling you in every direction, when you don't know what's true and what's just fear, don't act, don't reach out, don't send the message. Be still, get quiet, let the noise settle, and trust that the truth will rise to the surface when you give it the silence it needs to do so. Point 3. Begging for closure is a form of self-betrayal. Let's have an honest conversation about something that almost everyone does, and almost nobody admits is actually hurting them. Chasing closure. We have been taught by movies, by therapy culture, by well-meaning friends and self-help books, that closure is something we need, that before we can move on, we deserve a final conversation, a proper goodbye, an acknowledgement of the pain, an explanation from the person who caused the wound. And on the surface, this sounds reasonable, it sounds healthy, it sounds like the emotionally mature thing to pursue. But here is the brutal, uncomfortable truth. If someone truly cared about you, you would not have to beg for closure. They would give it to you naturally, with respect and honesty, because they would understand that you deserve it. And if they don't offer it, if they leave you hanging in ambiguity and pain, then your silence is not the absence of closure. Your silence is the closure. Epictetus said, "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it." At first, this might not seem to connect, but think about what it means in this context. When you stop begging for closure and start embodying your values, you stop needing other people to validate your pain. You stop outsourcing your healing to the very person who caused the harm. You take back the authority over your own emotional life and say, "My healing doesn't require your participation." Here's the cycle that plays out over and over again for people who chase closure. Someone hurts you. You demand answers. They respond with coldness or deflection or more cruelty or simply silence of their own. You feel worse than you did before you reached out. And the cycle repeats, each time eroding a little more of your dignity, a little more of your self-respect, a little more of your belief that you are someone worth treating well. The trap is the story we tell ourselves. If I just explain how I feel clearly enough, they'll understand. If I just get that one honest conversation, I can move on. If I just get them to admit what they did, the wound will close. But what actually happens is this. You end up pouring your rawest vulnerability into a space with someone who has already made peace with hurting you. You end up making your case to a judge who has already delivered their verdict. You end up hoping that someone who demonstrated they were not capable of treating you with care will suddenly, in this one final conversation, find the empathy and honesty they've shown no sign of having. That's not healing. That's self-abandonment dressed up as courage. The Stoics understood something about ego that is profoundly relevant here. They understood that much of what we call the need for closure is actually the ego's need to be seen as the good one, the right one, the one who deserved better. We want to be understood because we want our version of events to be acknowledged. We want to explain ourselves because we can't bear the idea that someone out there thinks poorly of us for reasons we know are unfair. But chasing that validation at the cost of your own dignity is a betrayal of your growth. It is choosing the temporary comfort of being heard over the lasting freedom of moving on. Real closure is quieter and more personal than any conversation could provide. It happens when you accept that what they gave you was the most they were capable of giving, even if it wasn't close to what you needed or deserved. It happens when you stop measuring your worth by how they treated you and start measuring it by how you treat yourself. It happens when you stop waiting for an ending that will never come and write your own. You don't need them to understand your worth. You need to understand it. You don't need them to say goodbye properly. You can close the door yourself. You don't need their explanation. Their actions already explained everything. You just have to be willing to believe what you saw instead of hoping for something different. So stop writing the unsent letters. Stop rehearsing the perfect confrontation in the shower. Stop waiting for a conversation with someone who has already shown you they're not capable of having it. Go silent, and let that silence be the space where your self-respect finally gets the room it's been waiting for. Point 4. Silence exposes what try to hide words are extraordinary things. They can build worlds and they can dismantle them. They can be used to express the deepest truth or construct the most elaborate lie. And in human relationships, particularly when someone has wronged you, words are almost always used to do one specific thing: cover. People apologize when they want to avoid consequences, not always because they feel genuine remorse. People explain when they want to maintain access to you, not always because they owe you honesty. People say what sounds right, what seems kind, what they know you want to hear, because words are flexible and malleable and can be shaped to serve almost any purpose. But silence cannot be manipulated. Silence does not perform. Silence simply exists, and in its existence, it strips away everything that words were designed to protect. Ralph Waldo Emerson captured this with a precision that has echoed through centuries. What you do speaks so loudly that I cannot hear what you say. This is the principle that's built their entire philosophy of human observation on. They did not judge people by their apologies. They judged people by their patterns. They did not trust words. They trusted behavior, repeated over time, in moments when no one was watching, in the choices people made when it was inconvenient to choose well. And the most effective way to see someone's true pattern is to stop filling the space with your own words and simply observe what they do in the quiet. Here's what happens when you go silent in the aftermath of being hurt or betrayed. The masks come off. Not all at once, and not always dramatically, but gradually, in the way people reveal themselves when they realize they can't manage you anymore. The truth emerges. The person who genuinely respects and values you will reach out. They will feel the weight of your absence and respond to it with honesty and care. They won't wait for you to come back and explain yourself. They'll come to you. The person who was primarily using you for emotional supply, for convenience, for the comfort of your constant availability, will fade. Because they never showed up for you. They showed up for what you gave them. And when you stop giving it, there's nothing left to draw them. The person who was manipulating you, who enjoyed having control over your emotional reactions, will do something very revealing. They'll get angry, or they'll try to provoke a reaction through someone else, through social media, through mutual connections. Because your silence removed their power. They expected you to react. They planned for it. They prepared their next move based on your predictability. And when you go silent, when you refuse to play the game, their entire strategy collapses. And in that collapse you see exactly who they were all along. This is what makes silence so clarifying. It's not just a tool for protecting your peace. It's a diagnostic. It tells you, with more accuracy than any conversation could, who is real and who is performing. Who is there for you and who is there for the access you provide. When you withdraw your words, you withdraw the scaffolding that was holding up an illusion. And what remains when that scaffolding falls is the actual structure of the relationship. Sometimes that structure is solid, and the person who matters to you reaches out, and the connection deepens. And sometimes, more often than people want to admit, you discover there was never much of a structure there at all. And here's the gift in that discovery. You stop wasting energy maintaining an illusion. You stop putting effort into a connection that only existed because you were carrying almost all of it. You stop believing what people say about how much they care and start paying attention to what they do or don't do when you stop making it easy. That's not cynicism. That's discernment. It's the Stoic practice of seeing things as they actually are rather than as you wish they were. It's uncomfortable, yes, but it's free. Point 5. Not explaining yourself is the highest form of confidence. There's a particular kind of discomfort that most people will do almost anything to avoid, and that's the discomfort of being misunderstood. When someone has the wrong idea about you, when they've formed a narrative about your motivations that isn't accurate, when they're telling a story about you that you know isn't true, the urge to correct it is almost overwhelming. You want to defend yourself. You want to lay out the facts. You want to explain, calmly and clearly and thoroughly, why the way they've characterized you is wrong. This urge is deeply human. It comes from a real and legitimate place. None of us want to be misjudged. None of us want the world to see us through a distorted lens. None of us are entirely indifferent to how we're perceived. But the Stoic knows something about this urge that transforms it. The Stoic knows that explaining yourself to people who have already made up their minds is not confidence. It is fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being seen as less than you are. Fear of not being in control of your own reputation. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Don't waste what remains of your life in speculating about your neighbors, unless with a view to some mutual benefit." And the inverse of that principle applies perfectly here. Don't waste what remains of your life trying to manage other people's perceptions of you. Because every time you try to convince someone of your worth, your goodness, your intentions, your loyalty, you are spending a currency that is genuinely limited, your time and your energy, on someone else's opinion. And that is not power. That is insecurity in action. The person who doesn't explain themselves is not arrogant. They're not cold. They're not indifferent to truth. They are simply at peace with something that most people spend decades trying to find. They are at peace with themselves. They know their own intentions. They know the alignment between their values and their actions. They know what kind of person they are, even when someone else's perception of them is completely different from reality. And because they know that, they don't need the validation of having someone else agree. This is genuinely difficult to practice, because the moment you stop explaining, you will face consequences. You will be called cold. You will be labeled arrogant or selfish or avoidant or emotionally unavailable. People who are used to having access to your explanations, to your justifications, to your constant availability for correction, will not respond well when you withdraw that availability. But here's the truth that sits beneath that discomfort. The people who require your explanations to understand you, who need you to constantly justify your peace, your boundaries, your distance, they were never responding to who you actually are. They were responding to the version of you that kept making itself smaller to fit their comfort. And losing access to those people is not a loss. It's alignment. The genuinely powerful, rare, almost magnetic thing about a person who doesn't explain themselves is this: they lead with energy. You feel who they are before they say a word. You sense their groundedness, their self-containment, their quiet certainty. And you can't manipulate someone like that. You can't destabilize someone who doesn't need your validation to feel stable. You can't diminish someone who doesn't measure their worth by your opinion of them. This is what makes Stoic silence so disarming to people who operate through manipulation. Manipulators rely on your reactions. They rely on your explanations, because explanations give them more material to work with, more ammunition, more insight into where you're vulnerable. When you stop explaining, you remove their leverage entirely. And the people who remain in your life after you've adopted this kind of quiet confidence, they are different. They don't need you to justify your peace. They understand your silence without requiring subtitles. They respect the fact that you don't perform for approval, because they don't either. Those people are your real community, and you'll only find them when you stop shrinking yourself to keep everyone else comfortable. You don't owe anyone an explanation for choosing your peace. You don't need to convince anyone that your boundary is valid. You don't need to translate your self-respect into a language that makes it easier for others to dismiss. Your silence already said everything that needed to be said. Point 6. Your detachment in silence is what teaches the deepest lesson. There is a kind of exit that words cannot accomplish. A kind of statement that only action, or rather the absence of action, can make. It doesn't involve slamming doors. It doesn't involve dramatic final messages that you immediately regret. It doesn't involve any of the theater that we've been taught to associate with meaningful endings. It's quiet, it's clean, it's final. You simply leave. And in that leaving, in that quiet detachment, you communicate something that no speech ever could. You teach the lesson that years of conversation couldn't deliver. Seneca, who wrote perhaps more practically about the human emotional experience than any other Stoic, observed something that cuts right to the heart of this. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. And when you go quiet, when you stop responding, when you remove yourself from the dynamic without drama or announcement, you leave someone alone with their imagination. You leave them alone with the questions their mind will begin generating in the absence of your predictable presence. You leave them alone with the memory of how they treated you. You leave them alone with the silence where your voice used to be. That silence is louder than anything you could have screamed. Most people are used to a certain script. They behave badly, you react. They pull away, you chase. They go cold, you pour warmth into the gap until things normalize again. They have come to rely on your predictability. They have, whether consciously or not, built their sense of security in the dynamic on the assumption that you will always show up, that you will always reach out, that you will always come back. When you break that script by going silent, by genuinely detaching, by refusing to show up in the way they expected, something cracks open in their understanding of the situation. They expected a reaction. They expected pursuit. They expected the pattern to continue. And when it doesn't, when your absence becomes real and lasting, when they realize that you're not coming back, not with the messages, not with the explanations, not with the emotional investment they took for granted, that's when the lesson begins. Not because you designed it that way, not because you're playing a game or trying to teach them something, but simply because reality is a better teacher than any argument you could make. Your absence teaches what your presence, constantly trying to be good enough, couldn't. They realize they had access to something they didn't value. They realize that your energy, your care, your willingness to show up was not unlimited or unconditional. They realize, perhaps for the first time, what they were actually losing, piece by piece, every time they chose not to show up for you. Some people learn from that. Some people change because of it. Some people reach out later with a different kind of honesty and a genuine reckoning with their behavior. And some people don't. And here's the thing that Stoicism teaches us about that possibility, the one that's hardest to accept. If they don't learn, if the absence doesn't register, if you walk away quietly and they let you go without a second thought, that tells you everything. It tells you that your silence, your detachment, your exit was not for them. It was for you. It was the act of self-preservation that set you free from a dynamic that was costing you far more than you ever admitted. The lesson wasn't for them, it was yours. You learned that your peace doesn't require permission. You learned that you don't need someone to witness your worth for it to be real. You learned that detachment is not the opposite of love. It's the fullest expression of self-love, the willingness to remove yourself from spaces that diminish you, even when it hurts, even when you miss the person, even when every wounded part of you wants to go back and try one more time. Detachment in silence is how you stop bleeding in front of people who don't know how to respond to your wounds. It's how you stop explaining storms to people who live indoors. It's how you reclaim the energy that was being pulled out of you and redirect it back toward your own growth, your own peace, your own life. The Stoics didn't seek justice through confrontation. They didn't chase validation. They understood that the most powerful response to being undervalued is to place your value somewhere that can actually receive it. And sometimes that means removing yourself from a dynamic so completely that the only thing left is the truth of who you are without all the noise. You don't have to announce that you're done. You don't have to make it dramatic. You don't have to perform your pain or your strength or your decision. You can simply be done, and let that silence do what it does best. Speak the truth that words never quite could. If you've made it here to the end of all of this, something in you is already different. Something shifted. Maybe you feel it as a quiet resolve. Maybe it's a kind of relief, the relief of permission, the relief of someone saying out loud what you've known for a long time but were afraid to act on. You don't have to chase. You don't have to beg. You don't have to explain yourself to earn a place in someone's life. You don't have to be loud to be heard. You don't have to prove your side to be understood. You don't have to fracture your own peace to maintain someone else's comfort. That is the foundation of Stoicism. Not coldness, clarity. Not detachment from love, detachment from chaos. Not the suppression of emotion, the mastery of it. The Stoics walked through the same human experiences that we navigate today. Loss, betrayal, misunderstanding, rejection, loneliness. The terrifying uncertainty of not knowing if the people you care about will stay. And they came to the same conclusion, again and again, written in the journals of Marcus Aurelius, spoken in the lessons of Epictetus, woven through the letters of Seneca. The answer is not out there, in someone else's response, in some conversation, in some explanation that finally makes them understand. The answer is here inside, in the quiet, in the discipline of staying with yourself when every instinct tells you to run outward looking for comfort, in the strength of silence when the world expects you to react. There will be moments, many of them, when your emotions rise up and demand to be expressed, when the urge to explain, to fight, to chase, to prove, feels almost impossible to resist. In those moments, come back to this. Your silence might not win the argument, but it will win you back to yourself. Every time you choose not to react in weakness, you build something. Every time you walk away quietly with your dignity intact, you build something. Every time you hold your self-respect in the face of someone who expected you to crumble, you build something. You build the kind of power that cannot be stolen. The kind that doesn't depend on what anyone else says or does. The kind that lives in you, rooted and quiet and unshakable, long after the noise of every argument and explanation and chase has faded into silence. Let your silence be your final word, not from ego, not from spite, not from coldness, but from the deep, unwavering, completely unshakable foundation of self-respect. If this spoke to something real in you, like this video right now, share it with someone who is in the middle of the cycle, who is still chasing or explaining or waiting for closure that isn't coming. They need this. Leave your affirmation in the comments below, and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because this is just the beginning of the conversation. Your final affirmation, drop it right now in the comments. My silence is my last word, and my most powerful one.